the world of the arts, the remarkable fact has very often been noted that what we still think of as modern painting and modern music and modern poetry and the modern novel all developed, roughly speaking, simultaneously. They all got going in the early years of this century and first became fashionable in about the 1920s. And in all the arts, modernism has had some strikingly similar consequences. For instance, in each of the arts there was a turning away from the unself-conscious depiction of the world, or of experience, and a turning in on itself. Art actually became its own subject matter. That's to say, it became familiar for, say, the subject of a poem to be the process of writing a poem, or the difficulties of being a poet. Ditto with plays and novels, and later even films. Music and painting, too, in their different ways, exhibited the same concern with their own innards, and very often turned them into their own subject matter, and put them on display. In all the arts, too, and perhaps this is related to the last point, there was a disintegration of traditional forms, a tendency to build new structures and to build them out of small, carefully shaped fragments. I'm emphasizing this because all this is true, and with remarkable exactitude, of philosophy as well, a fact which illustrates how deeply embedded the development of philosophy is in the cultural matrix of its time. Modern philosophy can be said to have started in 1903 with the breakaway of G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell from the idealism which had dominated the 19th century, and then, after the pioneering work of Russell, followed by that of Wittgenstein, who was a pupil of Russell, there developed in the 1920s in Austria the first fully fledged school devoted to the new philosophy, a school which was known as the Vienna Circle. To the philosophy they developed they gave the name Logical Positivism, and for a long time afterwards that label was attached to modern philosophy generally in the minds of very many laymen. The person who introduced logical positivism into England was A.J. Ayer, and his is the name that has been chiefly associated with it ever since in this country. He did so in a still very famous and widely read book called Language, Truth and Logic, which he published in January 1936 when he was only 25. It's very much a young man's book, explosively written, and it's still the best short guide to the central doctrines of logical positivism. The aggressiveness of that book was typical of the movement as a whole. They self-consciously organized themselves like a political party, with regular meetings and publications and international congresses, and they propagated their doctrines with missionary zeal. If we look at the question of what they were fighting against so passionately and why, I think that will provide us with the clearest starting point for our consideration of logical positivism. And then we'll be in a better position to go on and examine their own doctrines. Professor Ayer, what was it that the logical positivists were campaigning so passionately against?
Well, primarily they were against metaphysics, what they call metaphysics, and that was any suggestion that there might be a world going beyond the ordinary world of science and common sense, the world revealed to us by our senses. Already Kant, at the end of the 18th century, had said it was impossible to have any knowledge of anything that wasn't within the realm of possible sense experience, but these Viennese people went further. They said that any statement that wasn't either a formal statement, like a statement of logic or mathematics, or one that was empirically testable, was simply nonsensical. And so they cut away, therefore, all metaphysics in that sense. And this had some further implications. It was, for example, obviously a condemnation of any theology, any notion of there being a transcendent God. And this, although they were themselves not politically conscious, with one exception, there was one of them who was, but only one, a man called Otto Neurath, had political implications, because there was in Vienna at that time a rather bitter struggle between the socialists and a right-wing clerical party headed by Dollfuss, and the opposition of the Vienna Circle of Metaphysics was in part a political act, even though they weren't themselves primarily concerned with politics.
Now, you mentioned one of them by name, Otto Neurath.
Yes.
Since we're going to be talking about this circle of people, I think it'll be helpful if we get clear who the main individuals were. Who were they?
Well, the chief person, the leader of the circle, the official leader of the circle, was a man called Moritz Schlick, who was originally a German, and he came to Vienna at the age of about 40, in the early 1920s, in his early 40s. And he had, like most of them, or many of them, had been trained originally as a physicist and was interested mainly in the philosophy of physics. And in fact, one of the leading traits of the circle is the extreme reverence for natural sciences. And Schlick was their chairman, and he took up his chair in the middle 20s and started organizing the circle, I think, almost the moment he arrived there. Then the next most important person was another German called Rudolf Carnap, and he had been a pupil of the great German logician Frege. He'd been a pupil of Frege in Vienna, and he came to Vienna a few years after Schlick in the late 1920s, and in fact left Vienna in the early 30s for Prague, but was still a very powerful influence in the movement. He was the chief contributor to their journal, which was a journal called Erkenntnis. The third person was a man I've already mentioned called Neurath. I think he was an Austrian, but he was the most active of them politically, and in fact did have some post in the revolutionary Spartacist government in Munich after the First World War. And he was very nearly a Marxist. He wanted to combine positivism and Marxism, and it was he who was mainly conscious of it as a political movement. He wanted to organize it politically.
Now, it's obvious from what you said that this was a radically revolutionary movement. I mean, they were destructive of established ideas in religion, destructive of established ideas in politics, and above all, destructive of established ideas in the German philosophical tradition. And I suppose that the two main scalpels that they used to tear away what they regarded as all that diseased or dead intellectual tissue were logic and science, hence the name Logical Positivism.
Indeed. It wasn't quite so novel as all that. It was continuing an old, previous Viennese tradition. There was a scientist and a philosopher of science called Ernst Mach. He's the man against whom Lenin wrote his Materialism and Imperial Criticism, who flourished in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. He was a professor in Prague from about the 1860s onwards, then came to Vienna. And it was he who took the view of science that, for example, Schlick also took, that it must deal, in the last resort, simply with human sensations. Since all our knowledge of scientific facts comes through our senses, then Mach reasoned that in the last resort, science must simply be a description of sensation. And this the Viennese people took over. And, of course, they were following an old empiricist tradition. Although they didn't themselves know or care much about the history of philosophy, what they said was very like what was said by the English philosopher, Scottish philosopher, David Hume, in the 18th century. So to that extent, they weren't all that novel, they weren't all that revolutionary. What was revolutionary was, in a sense, their fervour and their seeing this as putting philosophy on a new road. They thought that here at last we've now discovered what philosophy is going to be. It's going to be the handmaiden of science. It wasn't so much that they used science in their philosophy as that they thought that the whole field of knowledge was taken up by science. I mean, science describes the world. The only world there is this world, the world of things around us and so on, and this is what science describes. And there isn't any other domain for philosophy to occupy itself with. Therefore, what can it do? All it can do is analyze and criticize the theories, the concepts of science. This is how science came in. Logic came in as supplying them with a tool. Logic had remained pretty much stagnant since the days of Aristotle, and then at the beginning of the 19th century, it took a move forward. There were some precursors, there was Boole and De Morgan, but the real jump came at the end of the 19th century with Frege in Germany, and as you yourself said earlier, Russell and Whitehead in England. And this generalized logic more widely than has been done. It didn't actually refute Aristotle. They showed that Aristotle was this little corner of logic, but they had lived a much more wide-reaching, far-ranging logic, which provided them with a very powerful tool of analysis. It enabled them to express things much more precisely. And since they were very interested in structure, since they thought that science was largely concerned with structure, with relations between things, the development originally by Schroeder and Peirce in the 19th century and by Russell and Whitehead in the 20th, of logical relations gave them a tool. It gave them a tool of philosophical analysis. This is what happened.
While I entirely take your point about Mach being a precursor of the logical positivist movement, it is true, isn't it, that in addition to there being a new logic at the turn of the century, there was also a new science. I mean, dramatically personified above all by Einstein, but there was this enormous breakthrough, a thought system of ideas which had started with Newton and which had been accepted as incorrigible fact by most of the Western world for nearly 300 years. This was beginning to break down under the influence of Einstein and the new physics, and surely that must have had an enormous impact on what they were doing.
This had a very important stimulus to them, because, in fact, Einstein had been affected by Mach. I heard it from his own mouth that he owed a great deal to Mach. And they saw Einstein's work in theory of relativity, and also they saw the new quantum theory, as a vindication of their approach. because what Einstein had done, and anyhow as they interpreted him, was to say you can't attach any sense to something like simultaneity unless you consider how statements about simultaneity are verified. That is to say that what is meant by talking of things being simultaneous depends upon how simultaneity is actually determined in observation. And they saw this as a great vindication within science of their philosophical approach. Similarly with quantum theory, I mean, the fact that in quantum theory no meaning is attached to a particle simultaneously having a precise velocity and a precise position, because this can't be tested, because if you measure the velocity, it distorts the position. If you measure the position, it distorts the velocity. Therefore, the scientists attached no meaning to this. They said this is a proof that what scientific concepts mean is determined by how they're verified, and this is what we're saying. And so this gave them an enormous stimulus. They said, well, science is on our side, we're interpreting science properly. And they were, as I said, Carnap and Schlick were originally physicists. Neurath was a sociologist.
So in other words, now we're getting at what the revolutionary nature of their work consisted
Yes,
in,
yes.
that they were applying the new logic and the new science
Yes.
to traditional methods of thought and breaking these methods down, as it were, under the impact of the new methods. Is that so?
Well, yes, what they wanted to say was that the old philosophical problems were either senseless or else capable of being solved by purely logical techniques.
Now, what were the main doctrines that they developed in the course of doing this?
Well, there were three, really. The first, everything hinged on the so-called principle of verifiability, which was put succinctly by Schlick as the meaning of a proposition is its method of verification. And this is slightly vague as it's there expressed, and we've labored ever since somehow to make it precise, and never wholly successfully. But it had two consequences. One was that anything that couldn't be empirically verified by sense observation, was meaningless. I've already referred to this. And secondly, it was interpreted by Schlick, later it got loosened, but in the early days by Schlick, as entailing that what a proposition meant could be described, by saying what would verify it. And so you get a reduction of all statements to statements about statements of immediate observation. This was the first point, which had both negative and a positive side. Negative as excluding metaphysics, positive as showing a way of analyzing what the statements that were significant. Then they held, this they got partly from Wittgenstein, but there is evidence that Schlick discovered this on his own, that the propositions of logic and mathematics, necessarily true statements, were what Wittgenstein called tautologies. They said the same thing over again, as it were. I mean, they
merely unpacked the content of what was already.
They'd like saying all bachelors are unmarried men, or all brothers are male. That all logical mathematics simply was what Kant had called analytic. That's to say, as you put it, unpacking the content of what you've already said. And then the third main thing was about philosophy itself. They thought that philosophy must consist in what Wittgenstein and Schlick called an activity of elucidation. I mean, I think there was a saying of Wittgenstein, which was quoted again by Schlick, that philosophy is not a doctrine, but an activity. It doesn't issue in a body of true or false propositions, because this is covered by the sciences, but simply is the activity of clarifying, analyzing, and in certain cases, exposing nonsense. I mean, Wittgenstein, at the end of his famous book, The Tractatus, had said, the right method of philosophy is simply to wait till somebody says something metaphysical, then show him it is nonsense, which is a bit, of course, negative and discouraging for a philosopher.
Well, now, taking off the first of those 3 points first,
Yes.
I think it'll be fairly clear to most people
Yes.
what's meant by the view that any statement about the world must make some observable difference to
Yes.
something if it's true.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's difficult to see how it can have any
Yes,
application.
yes.
When you say that the meaning of a statement consists in the method
Yes.
by which you verify it, I think that's probably not clear to some of the people who are listening to this discussion. Can you explain that a bit?
Yes, I can. Originally, it was thought by Schlick and by Mach before him, and possibly also by Wittgenstein, though it's not quite clear what Wittgenstein's atomic elementary statements are meant to be, that you could translate out all statements into statements about sense data, about immediate data of observation. And this was never actually achieved, and clearly runs into very great difficulties, for instance, in the case of universal propositions saying all ravens are black. I mean, all gases expand when heated, because the range covered by the all might be infinite. And of course, if it's infinite, then you couldn't possibly translate out. And so they then were driven to rather desperate expedients. Schlick actually said that statements of this kind weren't propositions at all, but rules, simply rules getting from one particular statement, this raven is black, this is a raven, to this is black, and so on, rules of inference. And then there were other difficulties. I mean, clearly, it seemed perfectly clear that if you take very high-level, abstract scientific propositions about atoms, electrons, nuclei, and so on, to try and write this out in terms of sensations, in terms of blues and rounds and warm feelings of warmth and so on, it simply doesn't work. And for various reasons, then, the principle got weakened, and it was the idea that you could translate out became given up, and all it was required was that these propositions, to be significant, should be confirmable by sense observation. And this meant that their meaning remained sort of partially undetermined. That it was thought that they got meaning from the cases where they were in fact confirmed, where the test could be carried out, and the rest was left rather vague. Also, this original view led to very implausible views, for example, about the past, because statements about the past were equated with the evidence we could now get for them. So saying Caesar crossed the Rubicon was held actually to mean, if I look up in the such history book, I will see it written, or if I go and dig, I will find such and such relics and so on. And I actually put forward this view in Language, Truth and Logic. It now seems desperately implausible to me. And again, there's a difference about other minds, of course. If I say that you're feeling such and such, I can only observe your behavior, and in the early days, the Viennese wanted to say that all those statements meant was statements about people's behavior. That again became doubted. So I think that the verification principle in its strong form really didn't last very long.
Let me just, we're covering a lot of ground very fast. Let me recapitulate,
yes.
Just to make sure that we've got things absolutely clear up to this point. According to what we might call the strong version of logical positivism, all meaningful statements were of two kinds.
Yes.
If either they were empirical statements about the world, in which case they must make some observable difference to something, and therefore must be verifiable if they're to be meaningful.
That's right.
It doesn't mean to say they're necessarily true, because we might try and verify them and find that they're not true.
Certainly.
But it must be possible for them to be true, and therefore possible for them to be verified if they're to have any meaning. That's one lot of statements, empirical statements. Or they must be about mathematics or logic, in which case they are purely self-referential. The true ones unpack what is already in the premises. The false ones are self-contradictions. Is right? And if a statement is of neither of these two kinds, then it's meaningless.
That's right.
And with that as a kind of weapon, they were able to chuck overboard whole areas of traditional discourse, not only in religion and not only in politics, but also in philosophy and no doubt all other areas of life. Now, one query that occurs to one straight away is this. If we make moral judgments or value judgments or aesthetic judgments, it seems pretty clear that these are neither statements about the world, nor are they tautologies. Now, that must have been obvious to the logical positivists from the start. How did they deal with this?
Well, it wasn't obvious to them that they weren't statements about the world. There's quite a long tradition in ethics which makes ethical statements what is called naturalistic, that is, statements about what is not conducive to the satisfaction of human desires, or to the furtherance of human happiness and so on. And this is the view that, for example, Schlick took. He wrote a book, rather a good book, called Ethical Questions, Frage und Ethik, in which he put forward the doctrine that what ethics is about is what human beings want and how their wants are to be satisfied. And roughly a form of utilitarianism. This is possible. Now, other people, Carnap, for instance, and also myself, took a different view. We took the view that ethical statements were much more like commands. I mean, not true or false, but I developed what's called the emotive theory, that the ethical statements were expressions of feeling. Carnap took the view that they were more like imperatives. So ethics is brought in therefore in one of two ways, either as in a naturalistic way, as being about what conduces to human happiness, which is then a scientific matter of fact, it's a matter of psychology and sociology and so on, or being treated as not indeed metaphysical nonsense, but as being not fact-stating, either imperative or emotive.
Well, now, when they used the verification principle, like a sort of Occam's razor, I mean, slashing about right and left
Yes.
and getting rid of all sorts of things, what difference did this make to the philosophical outlook of the people who were influenced by it? Because it did have an enormous effect on the way people saw the world and the way they saw philosophy.
Well, one effect it had was one you mentioned in your opening remarks, that it made philosophers very much more self-conscious about what they were doing. I mean, they had to justify their own activity on the assumption that the natural sciences took up the field, as it were. You then had to find a place for philosophy. Philosophy wasn't, as it were, allowed to be a competitor with them. And then people became much more self-conscious about what philosophers were about. And on the whole, the Vienna Circle wasn't the only influence. There was also the influence of people like G.E. Moore in England, who were defending rather similar views for very different reasons. Moore believed, for instance, that propositions of common sense were certainly true and so on, and it could be shown that this could extend also to the sciences, that each domain had its own criteria. Through the influence of the Circle and through the influence of people like Moore, philosophers came to think that their function could be only that of analysis. And then the question arose what analysis was, how it was practiced, what were its methods, what were the criteria, etc., etc.
So that, in fact, under this stimulus, the techniques of analysis reached a degree of
That's
sophistication
right, yes.
far greater than they'd ever reached before.
That I think is so.
Would it be a not unreasonable simplification to say this, that they thought that the job of finding out about the world and describing the world
yes.
was the task of science?
That's right.
So all the various sciences were doing that.
Yes.
And therefore, it wasn't the task of philosophy to find out about the world or explain our
Yes, well,
experience.
yes, I mean, it couldn't, as well.
No, there wasn't any space for it to occupy.
Yes.
So the task of philosophy, in fact, was to refine the methods of science, to clarify the concepts being used, to clarify the methods of argument being used, and perhaps most importantly of all, to separate out the legitimate methods of argument available to science from the illegitimate methods of argument.
You could put it in a technical way by saying that philosophy then came to be seen as a second-order subject. The first order being talking about the world, the second order being talking about the world. And
I think talk.
I think that's Gilbert Ryle's expression, that philosophy came to be seen as talk about talk.
Yes. And now we're talking about talk.
Yes.
This brings us on to the whole area of language.
Yes.
One striking feature of logical positivism was that it brought a wholly new emphasis to bear on the importance of language in philosophy. I have a quotation here from Bertrand Russell from his book My Philosophical Development, and it's very striking in this context because he tells about how, until he was in his mid-40s, and it's important to remember that by that time he'd done nearly all the work for which he's now most famous.
All the important work he'd done,
All the important work. He said this, that until that time he, and now I'm quoting, had thought of language as transparent. That is to say, as a medium which could be employed without paying attention to it. Now, I should think it's almost certainly true that virtually all philosophers until this century took a similar view. They didn't actually turn in upon themselves and examine the medium of thought and expression, language. They used it unselfconsciously, as if you didn't have to pay attention to it, you could simply use it about the world. Now, the logical positivists took an entirely different approach to language from that, didn't they?
Yes, I think this is right. You could say that the interest in language starts very early, even with Socrates, who went around asking his fellow citizens what is justice, what is knowledge, what is perception, and so on, what is courage. But he didn't see these, I think, as verbal questions. I think Plato saw them as questions about the nature of abstract entities, which he thought of as being real. They weren't seen as verbal questions, although in retrospect one can see them as having been questions about meanings, at least. I think that it probably does start only at the beginning of this century, this extremely conscious preoccupation with language. Wittgenstein and Russell, at the beginning of the century, were interested in the relation between language and the world. This was the great problem of Wittgenstein, the problem which the Tractatus was meant to be an answer to. And, of course, he ended by saying it couldn't be described, but only shown. But the intense preoccupation of philosophers with the way that language functions perhaps begins only in quite a late period after the last war.
It leads philosophers into a situation where as soon as anyone makes an assertion of any kind about the world, what you then do is examine the assertion. and you get straight away into the examination of statements, the analysis of propositions, an analysis of the relation of the terms of the proposition to each other, its logical form, and so on and so forth. And philosophy can soon seem to become, on that basis, about language. And indeed, it would be true to say, wouldn't it, that a lot of non-philosophers have acquired the view that philosophers are only concerned with language, and sometimes this is put disparagingly, that they're only playing with words. Can you give some explanation of why that sort of prejudice against philosophy, which is very widespread, is misplaced?
Well, a great deal of philosophy certainly is about language, and as far as it distinguishes between different types of utterance and analyzes certain types of expression. I think the main, I would make no apology for this, but beyond that, I think the answer I would give is that the distinction between being about language and being about the world isn't all that sharp, because the world is the world as we describe it. The world is the world as it figures in our system of concepts. And in exploring our system of concepts, you are at the same time exploring the world. Let's take an example. Suppose now one is interested in the question of causality. Now, and we certainly believe that causality is something that happens in the world. I'm bitten by the Anopheles mosquito, I get malaria and so on. One thing causes another. And one can put it by saying, what is causality? And this is a perfectly respectable, important, traditional philosophical question. You can also put it by saying, how do we analyze causal statements? What do we mean by saying one thing causes another? And in fact, although you look as though you're posing a purely linguistic question, you're answering exactly the same questions philosophers have always posed, only putting it in a different form. And we think, or most contemporary philosophy, a rather clearer form. Now, the point is that I think that there was a time, I think the fashion has passed, it happened about 20 years ago, and came to be known as the philosophy of the Oxford School, mainly through the work of a particular philosopher called John Austin. It wasn't universal even then, when philosophers were a bit inclined to study usage for its own sake, without seeing it as a means of solving any problems. And this, I think, is sterile.
That did become arid.
Yes. But I think mostly now, when people try to investigate the meanings of words, it is because these are concepts they're studying, which do play an important part in our description of what we think the world is really like.
Well, I think that what you've just said really boils down to saying that the investigation of our use of language and our use of concepts is an investigation of the structure of the world,
yes,
or the world
yes,
as experienced by human beings.
Yes.
There's an obvious relationship between what you've just said there and Wittgenstein's and the logical positivists' doctrine that philosophy, the proper task of philosophy, consists not in formulating doctrines, but in the activity of analysis. Philosophy ought to be analysis, and the organon of science.
Yes.
Now, this, it seems to me, had enormous influence on the educated layman. I went up to Oxford as an undergraduate during the years after the war, and people who were not studying philosophy at all seemed to me to have come very much under the influence of some of these doctrines. In particular, if one tried to make an assertion of any kind about any subject, nothing to do with philosophy, one was immediately pinned against the wall by people who said to you, how would you go about verifying that statement? Or what exactly do you mean by that? What kind of an answer do you want to that question? You're conscious of that having been so?
I think I was so. I think I was partly responsible for that, yes.
Now, coming to your responsibility for this, I think it would be interesting at this stage to come to your connection with the movement. You've described who the main people in Vienna were. You've talked about what some of their central doctrines were. Now, you are well known as the figure who introduced these doctrines into England, where they have, I must say, had an enormous influence ever since, right up to and including this day.
That's true, yes.
How did you come to do that?
Well, I was up at Oxford in late 20... I came up in 29, took my schools in 1932, and I was at Christchurch, a pupil of Gilbert Ryle's, and when I took my schools, I was appointed a lecturer at Christchurch and given a few months' leave of absence. And I thought I'd go to Cambridge to study under Wittgenstein, but Gilbert Ryle said, no, don't do that. Go to Vienna instead. He happened to meet Schlick at a congress, I think it was in Oxford also, 2 years before, And he had half an hour's conversation with him and thought that he was interesting and got the impression something was going on in Vienna. I think he'd also perhaps read some of the articles they produced. So he said to me, why not go to Vienna, find out what's happening there. We know roughly what Wittgenstein's doing at Cambridge. We don't know what's happening in Vienna. You come back and go there and find out and tell us. Well, I didn't speak very much German. I spoke hardly any German at that time, but I thought I probably could learn enough just to follow what was going on. And so I went with a letter of introduction to Schlick from Gilbert. And Schlick, I now see, in retrospect, I see this is astonishing. At the time, it seemed to be quite natural, but said, come and join the circle. And so I did. And the only other foreigner allowed in was Quine, American philosopher, famous American philosopher. We were there together. This was in what? I went to Vienna in November 32 and stayed until the spring of 33.
And you were in your very early 20s?
I was in my, yes, I was 20, let me think, yes, I was, no, I was younger than that. I must have been just 23, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
No, 22, I was 22, just 22.
Mm.
And I sat then, and I didn't contribute. My German wasn't good enough, and there was mainly debates between Schlick and Neurath at that time. On and on and on and on the discussion went, and I sat and listened, and then came back to England, very full of all this. I wrote a paper in mine called Demonstration of the Impossibility of Metaphysics, which was simply borrowed from the verification principle. And then Isaiah Berlin said to me, we used to meet regularly and talk philosophy together. He said, you're so full of this, why don't you write a book about it? And I said, why not? And so I sat down and in 18 months wrote Language, Truth and Logic. And I wrote it when I was 24, and it was published when I was just 25.
Were you astounded by the explosive consequences?
Well, it didn't have all that greater success at the beginning. It had a success at Scandard. The older philosophers at Oxford were absolutely outraged by it, and in fact, it was very hard for me to get a teaching job at Oxford. I didn't get one before the war. I was always a research fellow. It was only after the war, when it got reprinted, that it had this enormous success. And I suppose already before the war, when it first came out, it did impress the younger people. They were very excited by it, because they did see it as a liberation. You see, Oxford philosophy before the war was terribly sterile. There were some old men who were only interested in the history of philosophy, only interested in repeating what Plato had said, and trying to put down anyone, say anything new. And Language, Truth and Logic, with this huge mind put onto these people, did seem to the younger people as a liberation. They did feel they could breathe. And in that way it had a big historical effect.
And I'd like to hear you say something about the influence you think it had outside philosophy. It seems to me to have had obvious effects, not only in science and logic and philosophy, but in things like literary criticism or in history and so on.
It probably had less effect within science than, for example, the work of Karl Popper. His Logical Scientific Discoveries came out in the German edition in about the same time, a year or so earlier. I think probably appealed more to the scientists themselves. But even so, even with Language and Logic, the scientists felt that this was all right. I mean, they were told they were, after all, the most important people. That they didn't have to.
They liked that.
They didn't have to worry about the philosophers standing over and said, "Oh, we mustn't say that." Not that they had worried much, but it was nice to be told that what they were doing was really the fundamental thing.
But if one takes not only your book, but the whole movement, of which your book is about, Logical Positivism, what do you think the influence of that was?
Well, I think there was a great emphasis on clarity and a great opposition to what might be called woolliness. There was a kind of injunction to look at the facts, to see things as they are, be rid of humbug. All this is very attractive to young people in any field, and it felt and it went with, I think, a general reaction against Victorian hypocrisy, really. This was seen as stripping off, it was the Hans Andersen child, which, as you said in your opening remarks, was functioning everywhere, saying the emperor has no clothes. That is, parading around with these huge robes and so on, and placing us about our him. The fact the fellow's naked. And this notion the fellow's naked, which in fact the logical parts were taken to be saying, was very exciting for anyone doing any subject.
And of course, that is enough in itself to explain the huge and passionate hostilities that were aroused against logical positivism.
Yes, indeed.
Authoritarian governments like the communist and Nazi governments banded all together, didn't they? And even liberals were discomfited by it.
A little, yes. They thought it was too iconoclastic.
Yes. But now, it must have had actually some real defects. What do you now, in retrospect, think that the main shortcomings of the movement were?
Well, I suppose most of the defects is that nearly all of it was false.
Well, I think you need to say a little more about that.
Well, that's being too harsh on it, because I think that I still want to say that it was true in spirit, in a way, that the attitude was right. But if one goes for the details, First of all, the verification principle never got itself properly formulated. I tried several times, and it always let in either too little or too much. And to this day, it hasn't received a properly, logically precise formulation. Then the reductionism just doesn't work. I mean, you can't reduce statements. You can't reduce even ordinary, simple statements about cigarette cases and glasses and ashtrays to statements about sense data, let alone the more abstract statements of science. So the really exciting, strict reductionism of Schlick and the early Russell and so on doesn't work. And the only one is something rather wishy-washy, which almost nobody would dissent from, that a scientific hypothesis must have some relation to observation. I mean, this is all that remains there. It seems to me at least very doubtful whether statements of logic and mathematics are analytic in any interesting sense. But the whole analytic synthetic distinction has been put in question by the work of recent philosophers like Quine. It's no longer, I think so, I still want to maintain it in some form. It's no longer so clear-cut as I once thought it was. And I'm not sure. In some sense, obviously, statements of mathematics are different from statements about the empirical world. But saying, as I said, they're true by convention, I'm not at all sure this is right. Anyhow, it needs a lot of defending. Again, the whole, I mean, certainly in language and logic, the reduction of statements about the past to statements about their future evidence for them is wrong. My treatment of other minds was wrong. My treatment of ethics, I think, was still on the right lines, though much too summary. So if you go in detail, very, very little survives. What survives is the sort of general rightness of the approach, I think.
Would you agree with me if I try to put it this way, that looking back on it, what seems to have been enormously good about the achievement of logical positivism is almost entirely negative? That is to say, it did clear away whole areas of hitherto plausible philosophizing, which were now seen under through the lenses of the new logic and the new science, not to be acceptable. So that whole traditional areas got, so to speak, cleared of lumber. But it now looks as if all they actually succeeded in doing was clear the ground, because what they tried to build on that ground that they cleared isn't standing up.
Well, it's a little more than this. It was very liberating. I think perhaps we can go back to something said not by a logical positivist, but by a pragmatist, William James. And, of course, pragmatism, which came earlier, is in many ways very akin to logical positivism. William James had a phrase in which he asked for the cash value of statements. And I think this is very important on the positive side. The early positivists went wrong in thinking that we still maintained a gold standard, that if you presented your notes, you could get gold for them, which, of course, you can't. There isn't enough gold, and too many notes. But nevertheless, there must be some backing to the currency. And this is, I think, what comes out. But if someone makes an assertion, all right, perhaps you can't translate it into observational terms, but still it's important to ask, for clarifying it, how you would set about testing it, what observations were. But this, I think, still holds good and is positive.
Former logical positivists like yourself, although you now say that most of the detailed doctrines are false, are still immensely influenced by that whole approach, and are addressing yourself to much the same questions, but in a more liberal, open sort of way.
I would say so, yes. Now, I'm a much older man. I do it much more slowly, possibly, more certainly with less brilliance. There wasn't any brilliance before. Perhaps more soundly. I hope perhaps I've learned something with the years.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayer.